Hello, YouTube. Sidekick here with another episode of Moving Mud, a history of iron bombing. This is episode 25, Thunder from the Sea, which is about the U.S. Navy's role and experience in Operation Rolling Thunder. Now, in our last episode, we discussed how the Navy approached the early stages of the Vietnam War. We covered how its force structure, doctrine, and equipment, rooted in the lessons from Korea and tempered by the Cold War, had shaped the way the Navy fought or expected to fight. Now we'll pick up the story in March of 1965 as the air war over Vietnam really gets going. As you'll recall, the Navy had conducted strikes against some limited military objectives in the summer of 1964 in response to the Gulf of Tonkin affair, but after the initial response, the United States administration kind of put the brakes on. They were still hoping to convince the North Vietnamese regime that they really did not want to have the full weight of U.S. air power unleashed upon them. And, as we have also discussed, probably several times, this unfortunately had almost the exact opposite effect. Instead of trying to avoid triggering an air war, the North Vietnamese became convinced that it could not be avoided, and so they played for time while preparing for the onslaught. So, when the U.S. administration finally decided to demonstrate its willingness to deploy air power, they completely underestimated the impact that their demonstration would have. The administration expected that Rolling Thunder would be a limited and reasonably short-term exercise to demonstrate the effectiveness of U.S. air power, which would convince the North Vietnamese to back down and stay out of the conflict in South Vietnam. Instead, it became an ever-increasing spiral where the U.S. found that it had to apply more and more resources, both blood and treasure, which became less and less effective as the North Vietnamese responded by deepening their defenses and increasing their resilience to the attacks. So, in the spring 1965, though, the United States Navy kicked off Rolling Thunder with a relatively limited commitment of resources. There were 4 carriers, the newer supercarrier USS Ranger, and 3 Essex-class carriers, Hancock, Coral Sea, and Midway, that were deployed in March, which probably meant that at any one time there were 2 of those on station and operating against North Vietnam. The initial attacks conducted by the Navy were kind of in a perverse way the ones that achieved some of the best results. These were attacks that were conducted in the far south of North Vietnam, near the border. The targets were basically military infrastructure and logistics, including things like truck convoys, that were directly supporting North Vietnamese army formations, and these strikes were actually pretty effective at degrading the combat power of those formations. Now, in large part, this was probably due to a few factors. First of all, the air defenses were not very well developed in the area. Even the AAA defenses were relatively light compared to what was going to be encountered protecting high-value targets farther north. And also, I'd contend that the targets were relevant to daily operational readiness of the front line of military units, and this is a point which I've discussed on the podcast before, both in relation to World War II and Korea. It's pretty clear to me that air power is most relevant when it is used in direct support of military objectives, and not in order to achieve political or strategic effects. I'm not going to go back into that, but we have talked about it before. So it also seems to me that air power is really most useful the closer to the front line it's employed. By these metrics, the early Rolling Thunder targets were exactly those where air power could be used effectively. Unfortunately, it didn't last. While targeting North Vietnamese army installations and vehicles caused, actually substantial disruption to army operations, the impacts were not viewed as having had a dramatic enough impact on the communist government in Hanoi. So, the target list, which was controlled in Washington, began to move north and began to involve more visible and obvious high-value targets in an attempt to demonstrate that the U.S. could disrupt daily life in the country, not just in the army. And unfortunately, this meant that the targets became more difficult to engage and also much better defended because they were, high value and obvious. Now, as we've discussed, while the Navy did not formalize its doctrine in the way the USAF did, it's a little harder to pin down exactly what pin down their doctrine, but it does seem that it entered Rolling Thunder with a kind of playbook that was little changed from Korea, with the possible exception that the Navy expected the North Vietnamese to have a good ground-based radar coverage over much of the country, which had kind of been true at the end of Korea, but not at the beginning. As a result, the Navy placed even more emphasis on low-level ingress tactics. They were expecting that they'd avoid early warning radar, and they would depend on surprise and speed to reduce the effectiveness of AAA substantially by coming in low and not being expected. It didn't work out that way. In the case of the U.S. Air Force, the Navy found that while its jet aircraft might have been faster than in Korea, and maybe even harder to hit, they were also a lot more fragile. Even a single lucky small caliber round, the so-called Golden BB, could bring down an A4 over enemy territory. The A1s were a lot tougher, but they were also slower, and so were easier targets for the AAA, particularly the fast-firing 23mm and 40mm guns, of which the North Vietnamese had a pretty large and ever-increasing supply. So by the fall of 1965, the Navy was finding that its loss rates were actually unsustainable. In the first few months of Rolling Thunder, loss rates were running at about 15 per thousand, or 1.5%, and mostly due to AAA. Now, while that doesn't really sound like very long odds, to put it in perspective, a pilot that flew, say, 45 missions with those odds would only have a 50% chance of surviving without having been shot down at least once. The chance of surviving 100 missions, which would not be atypical of a deployment, was only about 25%. Now, this just wasn't sustainable. The Navy responded in much the same way that the Air Force did. They went from low-level ingress to high or medium-level ingress, and they started raising the minimum bombing altitude up out of the range of the lowest caliber AAA. And this did reduce loss rates. In fact, by the end of Rolling Thunder in 1968, loss rates were down by a factor of almost 4 to 4 out of every 1,000, which was deemed to be acceptable. Unfortunately, the change in tactics had the same impact on the Navy as it did on the Air Force. First of all, it began to dramatically affect the effectiveness of the strikes. As anyone who's ever tried it in simulation will tell you, staying above a floor of 4,000 feet requires releasing your bombs at 5,000 feet, maybe higher, and doing that with iron bombs with, what amounted still at this stage to an iron sight. The bombing computer, I don't think, was in a lot of use early in Rolling Thunder for a bunch of reasons. But let's just say it was dropping iron bombs with an iron sight from over 5,000 feet, not a recipe for high precision. This in turn meant that ever-increasing bomb loads were required in order to hope that the law of averages would make up for the lack of accuracy, which in turn meant that fewer strikes could be launched because more aircraft were needed to attack each target. And that problem was further exacerbated by the fact that high-level ingress meant that strikes were detected earlier, allowing defenses to be alerted. And then SAM defenses started coming online in midsummer, and suddenly no altitude was truly safe. So the Navy's response to this threat was a bit different than the Air Force, but some of the effects were the same. Namely, that more resources had to be devoted to countering the SAM threat, meaning that even fewer aircraft were available to actually drop bombs on the target. And the precautions necessary to counter the SAM threat further reduced the effectiveness of every strike by causing some of the strike aircraft to jettison their bombs and abort their missions. So the Navy also faced another serious issue that the Air Force really didn't, at least not the Air Force operating from Thailand. And that was that a significant proportion of their strike force, the aging A1s, were simply not able to perform this mission in this environment. By the fall of 1965, the A1s were really only being used in a strike role for targets very close to the coast, and by and large, they were actually being moved to the combat search and rescue role, where they would stay and excel for the rest of the conflict. But this had the effect of reducing, let's call it, the effective daily payload of a carrier air group substantially, because since the A1s made up a third of the strike force of an Essex-class carrier, and since they were designed to carry heavier payloads than the A4s, this was actually quite a serious reduction in striking power, probably almost as much as 50%, but certainly at least by a third. And, by the way, for all the spatifyles out there, we're definitely not done talking about the A-1. Despite being utterly unsuited to the role of medium strike aircraft, it would have proved to be a very effective solution to the problem of providing close air support to troops or stranded airmen on the ground. And we'll talk about that in another episode, I think. So anyways, for me, I would say that the first phase of Rolling Thunder was pretty much done in, let's say, October of 1965. Now, I've not seen any source that divides it this way, so maybe it's just me, but I find this a useful dividing line because a few things happened in the fall of 1965 that I see as representing a bit of a shift. First of all, in the fall of 1965, that marks the emergence of the first real coordinated suppression of enemy air defense efforts by both the Navy and the Air Force, including developing ways to counter the SAM threat specifically. We've talked about how the Air Force dealt with this threat. The Navy went a slightly different way. We'll talk about that in a minute. Secondly, the level of effort definitely increased. For a brief period in October and November, there were 8 carriers deployed to the Western Pacific, meaning the Vietnam theater, including the Forrestal-class Independence, the Kitty Hawk, which was the name ship of her class, and it followed the Forrestal class, and the very first nuclear supercarrier, the Enterprise. There would be 3 supercarriers in deployment all the way until the summer of 1966. Along with those carriers, of course, came the A6 squadrons that the larger carriers could handle, and they started replacing the A1s in the medium strike role. The Skyraiders continued as part of the carrier air groups assigned to the Essex-class carriers, but were assigned to combat search and rescue. Although not much gets said about it in the accounts I've read, but I also suspect that having more F4s on station, because they were the interceptors that came with the larger carriers, meant that there were actually more flak suppressors, or potential flak suppressors as well, because the F8s on the Essex class couldn't really be used in an air-to-ground role, but the Phantoms could. So overall, the striking power on station at any time really rose dramatically, almost by a factor of 3, maybe more. The fall also marked the first time when some carriers were making their second trip to Vietnam during Rolling Thunder, with the Ranger and the Hancock both coming back after having left in the spring or early summer. The other thing that happened in the fall was that the weather changed. Most of Vietnam has basically 2 seasons, wet and dry. Wet is in what we would call winter, dry mostly in the summer. But the far north of Vietnam has a more traditional 4-season climate, so the patterns get a little confusing. Either way, there is a significant transition in weather patterns that happens in October and November, and then again in sort of April, May. The interesting thing is that even though the winter is classified as the dry season, it actually seems to bring more challenging weather, at least for air operations, to the area of North Vietnam, where both the Navy and the Air Force wanted to operate. See, while the winter brings less periods of torrential rain, particularly in the south of the country, it also tends to bring more cloud and lower cloud and frequent drizzle or light rain in the north. One gets the feeling that the summer months tended to have periods of very high tempo of air operations, separated by short periods where operations just weren't possible at all because of the monsoon weather. In contrast, in the wintertime, the weather in the Gulf seems to have been pretty workable most of the time, but the strike packages would frequently find that as they approached their targets, the cloud decks appeared and they went down so low that there was really no safe way to deliver ordnance. The Air Force dealt with this problem by using a variety of radar bombing techniques, but the Navy didn't have that option, and they were forced to abort. And of course, the thick cloud cover brought the additional danger that SAM launches were more difficult to spot until the missiles were much closer, and early identification of the missile itself was critical to avoid being able to avoid them. So in short, the weather in the winter really compromised the effectiveness of the air campaign. And overall, it feels to me like the fall marks a transition from the early expectation that Rolling Thunder was going to be a short, sharp demonstration of American political will and firepower to the acceptance that this was going to be a long war. against a committed opponent. And so it was time to get serious about trying to survive it and then win it if it could be won. I'm pretty sure, for instance, that it was at this time that the issue of aircrew rotation started to receive serious attention. With the first carriers making their second deployments in the fall and a number more that were expected to be back for their second deployments in the spring and summer, I think it was some time to do some thinking about the effect of the operational tempo on morale. The issue for the Navy, as it was with the Air Force, was how to distribute the load. As it became clear just how much would be demanded of pilots in the combat zone, it became clear that some equitable way of distributing that increased commitment across more than just a few selected pilots was required. Now, the Air Force responded to this stimulus by setting a rule that no pilot would be asked, and I think maybe not even permitted, to spend 2 tours in Vietnam until every other available pilot in the Air Force had done their bit. This led to bizarre situations as the war progressed, where pilots were literally shifted from strategic air command and air transport roles to the tactical air command. So experienced, high-time C-130 pilots suddenly found themselves on a conversion course to the F-4 before being rotated to one of the frontline wings in Thailand. Well, we'll probably talk about that a bit more in a later episode, but this eventually, I think, had a truly ruinous effect on not only readiness, but morale, cohesion, and leadership, although maybe those effects were most serious after the end of Rolling Thunder in 1968. Now, the Navy took a slightly different approach. They also decided that the load needed to be spread more evenly, but they did it by rotating whole squadrons or carrier air groups through the active billets rather than by rotating individual pilots. Now, this still presented a challenge in terms of being able to learn quickly from the experience of combat, since a squadron with experience in the early days of Rolling Thunder might not make it back to the theater until, even probably a couple of years later. And in that time, many of the experienced aircrew will have been posted out. But often the leadership of the squadrons and even the carrier air group stayed with their units or were posted in after having had combat experience. So it did, I think, provide more continuity in the Air Force system. And as we've talked about in the last episode, since the leaders at that level had more autonomy to train their crews and set tactical doctrine, it made retention of that corporate knowledge more effective in the Navy, I think. It did not help the morale problem, though. In the Navy, pilots who really did not want to face going back into the combat zone knew that their only choice, really, was to get out before a unit they were assigned to was sent back. As a result, aircrew retirement spiked dramatically in the 1960s, both in the Air Force, but particularly in the Navy. So, as I say, I think it's fair to say that Operation Rolling Thunder entered a new phase for both the Navy and the Air Force in the fall of 1965. The reason I'm pointing this out is that it does make some difference in trying to read the source material that's out there. Like, most of the first-person accounts, as near as I can tell, come from the period after this point in time, by and large. And most of the third-party histories tend to lump the whole, the 2 phases, the whole of Rolling Thunder, together when they discuss things like approaches to suppression of any air defenses and electronic warfare. But they also seem to be talking about more about what happens after this transition rather than before. So it's a little bit hard to separate where things stood in the fall of 1965. It only really matters, honestly, if you're trying, as I am, to build a narrative of how the Navy's approach to dealing with air defenses, and particularly the SAM threat, evolved over time. Because it did evolve, and the tactics evolved, and the technology evolved, and frankly, the mindset evolved, and that set the tone for what happened not only later in Vietnam, but outside of Vietnam for the next 2 decades. So to me, it's important to see that evolution. It's just a little bit hard to extract sometimes. And it went, the Navy did go in a different direction than the Air Force. As we've seen, the Air Force responded to the SAM threat by standing up the Wild Weasel units, whose job was principally the identification and neutralization via jamming of the SAMs. Now, often the Air Force also employed a hunter-killer strategy, whereby the Weasels did the hunting and regular strike aircraft armed with bombs or rockets did the killing. And the Navy adopted a similar approach as well. The point being that the actual focus of the suppression of enemy air defenses was on finding and potentially neutralizing them, not necessarily killing them, because by the time you loaded up an aircraft with all the equipment it needed to do the former, didn't have a lot of room to do the latter. Now, the Navy, on the other hand, downloaded the suppression of enemy air defense task to attack squadrons themselves, but they also provided those squadrons with an aircraft that had SAM suppression capabilities built in. This was unlike any of the Air Force strike jets. The A-4E came equipped with the basic radar homing and warning receiver and the ability to carry the first anti-radiation missile, the AGM Strike. None of the Air Force jets got any kind of radar homing and warning receiver other than the Wild Weasels. None of the Air Force jets carried that equipment until after Rolling Thunder. This meant that any A4 squadron could provide organic SAM suppression in the form of what they called Iron Hand flights. Now, like the Weasels, the aircraft assigned to Iron Hand roles were expected to accompany the elements of the strike to identify and, if possible, locate SAM sites and engage them at a distance with strikes, and also to potentially close with the SAM sites and deliver bombs or direct accompanying aircraft to deliver those bombs. But those Iron Hand flights were assigned to specific strikes. They did not go and loiter in the area. They were not providing suppression overall to the entire mission. They were providing suppression only to their particular strike. Now, as far as I can tell, the net effect of the Navy's approach was probably approximately the same as the Air Force. Now, there may be objective and analytical comparison of the two approaches, but I haven't found one, although I have to admit I haven't looked all that hard. Any comparisons that I have seen tend to be what I would call opinions of the author, which are not invalid, but they're not objective either. Also, any comparisons that I've seen typically compared results over the whole of Rolling Thunder or even the whole of the Air War from 1965 to 1972. And as I've been saying, things really did evolve over that time. So it's kind of hard to compare the initial efforts of the Air Force and the Navy, at least from the sources I've been able to find. Now, it's certainly clear that SAMs occupied a lot of mind share in both places, at least in retrospect. Anyways, I think that gets us to the point where we've both followed the Air Force and the Navy up until the, say, end of 1965, which I would call the end of the initial phase of Rolling Thunder. I think at this point, both services have assimilated the fact that the conflict was not the one that they had expected. I think that they were realizing that they were basically unprepared for the conflict that they were actually getting into. Both the Air Force and the Navy had begun to realize that their doctrine, tactics, training, and equipment were not serving them well in this conflict. They were putting lives at risk, and they were not delivering results that had been expected, or that their senior leadership had promised the civilian administration in Washington. At any rate, I think I'm going to leave it there for this episode, because now in the next episode, I am hoping to take a look at the rest of Rolling Thunder and talk about what lessons, and in some case gradually and grudgingly, were being learned, because those lessons would not only shape the rest of the air war in Vietnam, but I think they would have a profound effect on the future of air warfare for the next 2 decades. And that's really what I want to talk about coming out of Vietnam. So let's talk about, or at least start to talk about that next time. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.